The title of the course here is yes, okay, gotcha. The title of the course is Permaculture 101. I guess that's kind of a ambitious title because if anybody hasn't been involved or studied permaculture, I guess the Bible or the original book about permaculture is a 700-word book written by a man named Bill Mollison. If you want to take like an introductory course to permaculture, what they call the PDC or the Permaculture Design Certificate, it's a minimum 15-day course. So to think that we're going to, amply discuss permaculture in 45 minutes is perhaps a little naive. So I'm going to try and resume as much as possible some of the things that I find that I have found very important, both in the work that I do, that I've done in the development industry, and then also as a small farmer myself. So yeah, the idea of Permaculture 101, the subtitle of the course is How Careful Observation and Design Can Help Rural Communities Reconnect with Their Places, Produce in Abundance, and Regenerate Degraded Landscapes, right? In the outline of the class, I'm going to try and keep it very short, but the idea is, try and introduce what is permaculture. I've already seen one of the questions that where did that come from? What is this word? It's something that if you've never heard of it, it sounds maybe strange. It sounds kind of like permanent, but it also sounds like agriculture. But so we're going to talk about a little bit about what is permaculture, some definitions, and a little bit of history. And then we're going to the majority of the class is going to be looking at some of the key concepts of permaculture. Like I said, it's an extremely broad movement. Permaculture has been attempted to be implemented in all sorts of different landscapes, from dry deserts to the northern Arctic regions to tropical rainforests. So it's an extremely broad movement, but at the same time there are some key concepts and principles that are at the very base of permaculture. We're going to try and look at those, and we're also going to talk a little bit about three, perhaps you could say, historical or indigenous examples of permaculture. One of the worst misconceptions, I think, is that this idea is that permaculture is a new movement. It's something, or that it was something that was started, just 30, 40, 50 years ago by people. Here in Central America, the idea of permaculture tends to be associated with foreigners, especially people from Europe and North America who move to Central America, buy up these idyllic, paradisical, really nice farms, and label or brand themselves as permaculture farms. And I think that that's about as far as you can go from what real permaculture is. And then lastly, turn our attention to the practicality of the permaculture movement, or how people who live in rural communities around the world can use the principles, the concepts, the idea, the importance of observation to reconnect to their territories, to reconnect to their places, and to create a sense of belonging to the places where they live. If you look up permaculture on Google, if you put it into Google, you'll probably find thousands of pictures like this. There's all these really great illustrations and designs, and permaculture is really good about being visual in that sense, that you can see these really great maps about how people have mapped their lands and designed their landscapes for production. But one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at this picture, you should notice that it's not just about agriculture. And that's one of the ideas that people has, that permaculture is simply about helping people to grow things more sustainably, more organically, depend less on chemical pesticides and herbicides and all that. And that's certainly a part of it. But permaculture is a much broader movement. So if you look at this picture, this is an idea about how to design not only our agricultural landscapes, but also our homes, how we use our energy, how we orient ourselves as a community, how we belong to the sense of land. You can see obviously that there are some solar panels and wind turbines and solar water heaters. So it's all about, the issues of sustainable energy use. There's also several homes in one space. So it's the idea about using resources collectively, perhaps, or sharing in a more wider base. There's also trees and crops, trees that are interspersed with the crops. So it's not just about necessarily growing food, but also about making sure that we have enough fuel. It's about regenerating places. It's about taking care of soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So permaculture is a movement that goes beyond agriculture. Agriculture is perhaps, the growing of food, a surplus of food to feed ourselves and our communities, is certainly perhaps at the foundation, a foundational element of permaculture. But it's also about how we can design our lifestyle in a sense that we do less damage to the earth, but that also that we create a sense of social justice with those that live around us, and then we protect the world for future generations. So let's start with a very basic generation. What is permaculture? So in the simplest terms, here's a fairly widely shared definition of permaculture. It says permaculture is a way of seeing the world through nature's eyes, a lens through which to view the world based on three core ethics: earth care, people care, and future care or fair share. This requires constant observation, adaptation, and a deep sense of belonging to place. So yeah, that's what the first part of that definition is perhaps the most fundamental. Permaculture is about learning from nature, right? It's about, if you go to any large scale industrial farm today, it's about as far removed from the natural world as you can think, right? For one, you have monocultures, sometimes tens of thousands of acres of corn or soy or cotton or whatever the commodity crop that we want to grow. That in itself is pretty much the exact opposite of how nature operates. Nature operates on the basis of diversity, ever greater diversity. If you go into a forest, you're never going to find one species of tree. They're never going to be planted in straight rows. There's not going to be, this almost kind of like business-minded focus on production. And so agriculture today, especially industrial agriculture, has moved so far away from trying to mimic the natural world that it's almost comical, right? Permaculture, in a sense, is about the opposite. It's about looking at how nature creates these enormously diverse and resilient ecosystems, right? Places that are extremely rich and biodiverse and healthy, fertile. And how can we try to create agricultural systems and communities and life systems that mimic that? And to do that, observation is extremely important. It starts with stopping. Instead of coming into a place, cutting down every tree for a square kilometer and bringing in the big tractors to plant corn or soy or cotton or whatever it might be, the idea is to stop and observe nature, see what she is doing in this place, and slowly try to implement designs that allow us as human beings to survive, to provide us with food, with shelter, with fuel, with fibers, and all of these things, but in a way that mimics the way that the natural world works. And permaculture, like it says here, this picture on the right, is based on three ethics. Permaculture has tried to steer away from from being intimately involved with any type of specific religion or religiosity or spirituality. There are people practicing permaculture in Muslim countries and Christian countries, people who are atheists, people who are perhaps more animists. But one of the things is that these three core ethics are things that can be shared by everyone. And it's the idea that in all of our designs, in how we relate to the world, we need to take into account three core ethics: that everything we do, we care for the earth, and that everything we do, we care for others, and that when those two, when there's still an abundance after that, that we re-implement or that we reintroduce any sort of surplus that we may have into care for future generations and distributing so that other people can participate in this process, right? And obviously that third ethic is one that is, again, completely contradictory to the world in which we live today, wherein profits and surplus is redirected into shareholders' pockets, increasing all sorts of issues of income inequalities and poverty and issues like that. So the idea is that no, if there is a surplus after this work of creating sustainable farmscapes, sustainable ecosystems where we survive, then we need to reintroduce that into the other two ethics, right? Permaculture, the word itself was first coined in the 1970s by an Australian agronomist by the name of Bill Mollison. He died just recently, but he is a very, foundational figure of the permaculture movement. He worked for several years kind of as a run-of-the-mill agronomist. And then after traveling the world, especially after interacting with indigenous cultures in different parts of the world, he started to question, some of the principles of agronomy and farming that he had been taught. And he started to say that, look, we need to rethink how we grow our food and how we design our societies. And here are two quotes from Bill Mollison's main book, which is called Introduction to Permaculture. Like I said, it's a massive book filled with an enormous amount of wisdom and knowledge. But here are two quotes. It said, permaculture is an integrated and evolutionary system of perennial or self-perpetuating plants and animal species that are useful to humans. The conscious permaculture is also the conscious designs of landscapes that mimic the patterns and the relationships of nature, while supplying abundant food, fiber, and energy to meet local needs. And that last part is important. Again, returning to the idea that permaculture is not just about food production; it's about providing food, fiber in the sense of what we use for the shelter, to clothe ourselves, and energy, right? How can we harness the energy of the sun, the energy of burning wood to heat our homes, to cook our meals? But how can we do all of this in a way that mimics the patterns and the relationships of nature, right? And like I said, we've talked about in the past, one of the problems I see in our modern day globalized, industrialized society, ever more technological, is that we are so far removed from the landscapes and the designs and the patterns and relationships of nature that it's almost impossible to design a sustainable life system, right? And that's where when you're so far removed from that, when people have no idea where the energy comes from, where their food comes from, where the clothes that they use come from, then it's hard to say that we're going to design in a way that mimics these sustainable, healthy, fertile processes of nature. And Bill Mollison, so in many senses, Mollison was saying that permaculture needs to be also a return to a localized sense of belonging, right? If you're going to mimic nature, you have to be close enough to it so that you can see how it works, right? And so that you can observe how these patterns and processes and relationships work. All right, let's start to turn our attention now to some of the key concepts of permaculture. One of the most perhaps famous concepts of permaculture is the idea of designing a landscape in zones, right? And so again, if we go back to the monoculture field in an industrial farm, there's no such things as zones. Everything is standardized. Everything is technologically uniform. You have one crop grown along enormous amounts of space. And permaculture says no. And if you look at nature, I'm looking out my window right now at the mountain, and there are certain places where there's deep forest. There's other clearings where you can see grasses growing. There are other places where we just had a big windstorm that knocked down some trees, and there's already starting to see some pioneer trees starting to take over. In each of these different areas of the mountain, there's different habitats for different species. There's different crops that grow, different types of plants that grow. And the same thing we can see, when we design our landscapes. And again, when permaculture talks about landscapes, it's not necessarily saying that you have to have a 50-acre farm or a 100-acre farm. You can design a landscape on the scale of a small backyard. If you live in the city and you have a small allotment, you can design, different zones by looking at, how your landscape, the place where you live and you have your being and you're sustained by, how that place reacts with the different elements and forces of nature. So, for example, here on my farm, we have about 1 hectare of land. But even on this small place, we've divided our farm into different zones based on what area gathers much more sunlight, what area is where all of the humidity of the soil tends to accumulate, what areas are drier, what areas receive more wind, in which areas are there better soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so permaculture encourages people to design their landscapes into the zones 1 through 5. If you look at this picture on the right, here's a house. In zone 1 is generally the place closest to your home. So here, for example, you have a herb spiral, the idea that the closer we are to the home, the more time we're going to spend there, the more intensively we're going to work that. As you move away from the home, you go into intensive gardens. This could be considered zone 2. It's a place where we might not go every day, but several times during the week, we're going to weed the gardens, we're going to add more compost, etc. As you go a little bit farther out, zones 3 could be the area where you have poultry or rabbits or small livestock that you rotate through pastures and things like that. It might be the shed. You might have some vines. As you go a little bit farther out, zone 4 might be the place where you're growing woodlots, right? Where you have a forest that you very minimally manage so that you can have your own firewood to heat your home, to cook your food. Zone four might be, also a orchard with nuts and fruit trees that you also don't interact with very daily, but that does depend on your human labor. And then zone 5 is usually kind of the idea of a wild area, right? An area where you as a human being do not do anything but let nature take its course. And the idea there is that there should always be a place on your land, on your landscape, where you can truly observe how nature acts. To say, if I were not here, if human beings were not trying to manipulate the environment, what would nature be doing here? In zone 5, then, in that sense, is a learning area. It's a classroom. It's a nature classroom. It's a place for us to go to see what nature would do if we were not here, right? So the idea is by dividing your landscape up into zones, you can better try to mimic how the natural world itself operates. Another concept I think is important is the idea of constant observation, right? You need to observe and interact before acting, before doing anything on your landscape. It's necessary to take the time to observe what is happening. A lot of times, people in the permaculture movement encourage you, if you're going to move to a farm, if you're going back to the land, or if you just, recently open, are starting to work a piece of land that had been abandoned, don't do anything immediately. Take some time, if you can, a year, to observe how your landscape changes throughout the seasons, how it interacts with the sun, with the rain, with the winds, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that by observing your landscape, you can better design, so that, for example, in one part of my land, the first year when we got here, we were so motivated and excited. And one of the first things that we did is we dug a pond by hand. And that was an enormous amount of work, and it was wrong. It was wrong because we dug the pond in one of the driest areas of the farm. And it's always hard to keep that. It was hard to keep that pond filled up. So eventually, what we ended up doing is refilling in that pond and moving it back to a different part of the area. And that could have been, obviously, all of that that wasted work could have been avoided by taking the time to observe, right, and to continually observe and learn, how you can better instill agricultural systems, food lot systems, agroforestry systems that work with nature. And again, by doing this, by observing and adapting your landscape to the natural patterns and rhythms and relationships of nature, you can also, save yourself labor, right? Another concept is the idea of trapping and storing energy, right? Again, if you trying to compare how permaculture operates compared to our modern industrial, food corporations and things like that. The food corporations or industrial farms rely on an enormous amount of energy. And it's not about trapping and storing about that energy. It's about bringing it in from the outside, using it, these massive combines, the enormous amount of energy that's needed to produce all of these synthetic fertilizers and other agrochemical inputs. But the idea of permaculture is no, look at how your landscape how energy sources, free energy sources, interact with your landscape, and how can you trap that and store that. So obviously we think about energy in terms of electricity, so solar panels and wind turbines, mini hydroelectric plants. All of these things are ways to use energy and store it. Also, you could say water. The way that water interacts with your landscape, water is a source of energy as well. And one of the most perhaps famous systems that permaculture encourages is digging what they call swales, on contour swales throughout your landscape. And the idea is that when it rains, when there's hard rains, that water, the energy of water running over your landscape, usually causes an enormous amount of erosion, right? And by observing that, we can create swales on contour so that the water, instead of running over the energy of water running over the landscape, doesn't degrade the landscape, but rather it infiltrates into the landscape in these areas of swales and berms, so that year one we have a small water table, year two, year three, it continues to expand. So we're trapping and storing water energy into our landscape so that we need less irrigation, so that there's less less sources of erosion, etc. Right? Another concept that I think is extremely important is how we need to move from mechanical and technological solutions to biological solutions. This is a key aspect in making landscapes sustainable. And I'll share a short story. When I first moved here with my wife and my young daughter, the farm that we had purchased had been abandoned for several years, and it was completely overgrown with weeds and vines. And for much of the first year and a half, I spent an enormous amount of energy with my machete, chopping things down and trying to control this incredible growth of biomatter. Eventually, I purchased a weed whacker, so something that uses gasoline, and that made it a little bit more efficient to try and keep the weeds at bay and grow grasses. But that was an enormous amount of work. I would cut down all the weeds; everything would look really nice for a week, and then after the rains came, the weeds were back again, and I have to go out and do it again. And so about 6 years ago, we purchased a couple sheep and a couple goats, and we rotate them throughout our farm. And for the last 6 years, I haven't had to use any sort of that weed whacker, which is an annoying, loud, dirty machine. Because now we've transitioned to biological forms of weed control, which is essentially allowing animals to eat them, process them, and in the process we receive a free source of fertilizer and free meat and dairy products through our dairy goats. Another example of that is fencing. A lot of people, when they think about fencing, the first thing they do is buy some metal posts and some barbed wire or chain link fence, and that might be necessary in the interim. But the idea is, how can we move to more biological solutions? So living fences. You can create living fences with. For example, like we see in this picture here. So again, the idea is always to move from technological or mechanical solutions to biological solutions. Another concept of permaculture that I find interesting is the idea of accelerated succession. And so the idea is, if you leave a landscape to itself, if human beings were completely to move away from an area, a lot of people in the environmental movement called that the importance of rewilding, right? Simply don't allow human beings to manipulate certain spaces. And the idea is that over several decades, sometimes several centuries, that landscape will rehabilitate, will regenerate, and eventually it'll grow to what they call a climax ecosystem. So, for example, in the area of El Salvador where I live, if somebody were to come down, if let's say a hurricane came through and knocked down some of the old growth forest, it would take perhaps several hundred years, but eventually, the old growth forest would be colonized by weeds. Mushroom, fungi, and insects and microorganisms would decompose all of those trees, create rich organic matter. Some of the seeds would start to poke through the weeds. There would be some pioneer species of trees, and then eventually, over hundreds of years, we would eventually get back to that climax ecosystem state of native forest that we have here. But the idea is that human beings don't necessarily have to be a negative part of the landscape. With a little bit of good design, we can also help to accelerate the natural succession. So, for example, here on my farm, there's a part that had been degraded, that had been farmed intensively over the years, and then it had been abandoned. There was this enormous amount of weeds. And eventually, over time, perhaps an old oak tree would, send its seed down there, and that would poke through the weeds, and it would begin the slow succession of returning to a forest. But what we did is we came in and we cut down all those weeds. We planted a food forest, which is, a multi-strata agroforestry system where we have the high canopy of nut producing trees. We have some macadamia nuts, we have some chestnut trees and others. Then we have lower layers, like you see in a forest, of some nitrogen fixing trees that produce organic matter and free fertilizer. And then below that, we planted some coffee. So the idea is that, with right design and by observing the natural world, we can accelerate the natural succession that happens in the natural world. Another concept, and this I think is very easy to observe in the natural world, is that there should not be any waste. Right? If you look at the natural world, when a tree loses its leaves, those leaves fall down. They are food. It's a waste material for the tree in a sense, but that waste material becomes food for the microorganisms on the soil. They're broken down by a mixture of all sorts of soil bacteria and fungi that interact in this symbiotic relationship, where there's also all of these relationships between fungi and roots, and this allows the tree to grow, to produce new leaves, and the cycle continues. In the same way, you see this everywhere, right? And we need to do the same thing, right? We need to try not to generate waste. The idea is that everything that we do on our farms, in our homes, when those things eventually die down, how can they not become waste? So, for example, the house that we built, where my family and I live, the vast majority of it is made from local materials. So eventually, in 100 years from now, when I'm dead and maybe my children have moved away, my grandchildren, and a storm comes and knocks over my house, the mud that makes up the walls is going to sink back into the soil. The wood that makes up a lot of the house is going to be decomposed and add to the fertility of the soil. And that's a huge difference than these steel in concrete buildings, wherein if they do eventually break down, they're not going to be a regenerative part of the landscape. They are going to be waste. So the idea is to create closed circuits in everything that we do, so as to minimize as much as possible any source of waste. Let's see. Yeah, two more, or one more concept. Again, there's a bunch of them, but here's just one more. The idea of ever increasing diversity. And this is extremely important, I think, because as we mentioned, the natural world is never a monoculture. A lot of times, I remember the first time that I traveled across the United States when I was a young man, and you travel through these enormous prairies, and you look at it, and everything looks so similar. You say it's just one big grassland. And so I guess on the outset, I remember thinking, well, this is kind of a boring landscape. But if you get closer to these natural prairies, there are hundreds of different types of native grass species, of native flowers, of wildflowers. Underneath that soil, there's an enormous diversity of soil microorganisms. There's all of these different insects that are involved in a native prairie, and then there's the large herbivores, the bison that move over this place. So in every place where nature is allowed to thrive, there is diversity, and we need to do that as well in the landscapes that we design. We need to use and value diversity. In a very practical manner, it's kind of similar to this idea of not putting all of your eggs in one basket, right? The more variety of things that we grow on our farm, the more resilient we're going to be. If we have bad luck and rains come and ruin our peach harvest, well, we might not get a bunch of peaches, but maybe the rains help the macadamia nuts who really like humid climate. So we're going to have more macadamia nuts in 1 year and less peaches. Maybe if we grow different types of wood species on our farm, if there's a beetle that comes and attacks the pine trees, maybe it won't attack maybe they don't like the alder tree. So we'll have plenty of alder wood that winter for heating our home. So the idea is ever increasing diversity is not only good for nature, it's also good for ourselves, of course. So let's talk about, where permaculture came from, stems from. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, permaculture is most certainly not something that was developed in the 1970s by Bill Mollison. He might have coined the term, but this idea of designing landscapes that mimic the natural world through long and patient observation, if we take that as the basic definition of permaculture, then we should say, well, pretty much every indigenous culture that has ever existed or that continues to exist are the prime practitioners, the prime examples of permaculture in action. And here's an example. On the right here, you'll see two pictures of soil. The picture on the right, where it says normal, that's what most soils look like in pretty much any tropical forest. A lot of times we have this idea that tropical forests are extremely fertile, and they have an enormous amount of diversity, but the soil itself is relatively poor. And that's because there's so many insects that every time a leaf drops onto the forest floor, before it can decompose, it's devoured by millions of insects and worms and all of these things, right? And so several years ago, there were researchers who were looking, exploring the Amazon rainforest, the largest rainforest in the world. And they saw lots of soil that looked like this, but then in several key places, they found this extremely deep, dark, rich, fertile soil that they called terra preta, which means dark earth. And after studying this and doing all of these radiocarbon testing and all of these things, they determined that it was biochar, that these soils were created by indigenous cultures over tens of thousands of years. It was a way that the indigenous peoples actively managed and planted and cared for the Amazon rainforest. They created these extremely fertile areas where they could choose which sources of trees that they would grow, which sources of underbrush. And so in many cases, there are huge areas of the most rich and biodiverse rainforest on the earth, which is not just necessarily a naturally occurring rainforest, but one that has been created, cared for, managed for tens of thousands of years by an enormous amount of indigenous cultures that live throughout the rainforest. And if that's not an example of permaculture in action, then I don't know what is. And if we look at the idea of accelerating succession, of managing biodiversity, et cetera, that's exactly what the Amazon rainforest is. It's perhaps the most stable and resilient and beautiful ecosystem on Earth that has been slowly created over tens of thousands of years. Another example here in Central America, we talk a lot about food forests in permaculture, and there's this huge movement to try and encourage people to move away from just annual cultivation. So, for example, not just growing grains and carbohydrates and protein sources that you have to plant every year, but slowly transitioning landscapes into more perennial systems through food forests. So the idea, for example, instead of growing corn and beans every year, maybe you can grow chestnuts, and there's all sorts of bean species that grow on trees. Grow fruits and vegetables that are also more perennial systems through this idea of food forests. But that idea, the idea of creating perennial agricultural systems, has existed for tens of thousands of years here in Central America. If you go to pretty much any indigenous area of, let's say, Guatemala, you'll notice that around everybody's home, there's not this really neat lawn with some pretty landscaping, but it looks like this wild, overgrown forest. You'll see, all these trees that are grown everywhere. You'll see vines climbing up the trees, bushes underneath the vines. And what it is a permaculture. People might have, a couple large mango trees, and underneath those they have some coffee and some bananas, and then some passion fruit vines that are growing up there. And a lot of people call these the Mayan forest gardens, which is essentially a way of creating this perennial agricultural system, which is what the Mayans have done for thousands and thousands of years. Another example of indigenous permaculture that's not necessarily related to agriculture, you can see in some of the semi-nomadic hunter and gatherer cultures, especially, for example, in the Great Plains, like I mentioned earlier, in the United States. So indigenous people such as the Sioux and the Cree, the Utes and others, they lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle that was completely dependent on the maintenance of these extremely fertile native prairies and the buffalo and bison herds that moved over them. So these cultures learned that if they were going to break up the landscape and try to farm, which is what the United States government tried to get them to do in the 1800s, that was a recipe for ecological disaster. And if you look at what is happening in the Midwest of the United States, you have an enormous amount of what they call the dust bowls, and just enormous amounts of soil loss and erosion. In the indigenous cultures, I think, understood that the best way that they could live sustainably and healthy and happy lives is by avoiding that tendency and simply following the food as it moved over the landscape. So that's an idea, again, of observing nature and adapting a lifestyle to what that local ecosystem allowed, right? Which again is the essence of permaculture: observing, learning from the patterns of nature, and trying to live in a way that respects those boundaries, those lessons, etc. So I guess the last part here is I have a couple more slides and then a short video to share. But how is permaculture useful or practical for us today? So, for example, let's turn back now to the issue of development. Those of us who work in the development industry, of us who work with small farmers or local communities, or even people who live in urban and suburban areas, how is permaculture useful today? And like I mentioned earlier, I think that today it's fairly fair and easy to say that the vast majority of people are increasingly uprooted, from any sort of connection to specific places. Uh, we see that by this tendency to move to urban areas here in El Salvador. Every day, there are people from my community who migrate either to San Salvador, which is the capital city, or to the United States and Canada. Because of this, we have limited ability to read or understand our landscapes. We don't know how the natural world anymore works. We here in our ecotourism cooperative, we always have people come and we try and share with them, this is how food is grown. It's amazing how many young people have no idea how food is grown, where it comes from, the process of milking your cow, of looking for eggs in the morning, of harvesting fresh food from the landscape. So many young people today don't have that because they live in this little technological bubble, these areas where food comes from supermarkets instead of from the land. A lot of because we're so mobile, we move so much, and we're unskilled. We've lost a lot of the ability to actually work, to do the work that's necessary to adapt our lifestyles to a place. So how can permaculture respond to this reality that perhaps we could say 30, 40 years ago this was a fair definition of what it looked like to live in Europe or North America or Japan or certain developed areas. But I think that because of the monocultural aspect of our culture, this is what's being globalized. This idea of people wanting to have a paid job and have purchasing power and be liberated from having to work the land. And I think that this definition of what we are creating is being globalized, right? So how can permaculture respond to that? Well, permaculture offers us an opportunity, in theory, to reconnect with the earth and the specific ecosystems and places that sustain us, right? It obligates us to stop and to notice the world around us, to try and understand, where our food comes from, how it's produced, where is the energy that we use every time we turn on a light, what about the water that we use? Permaculture says you need to stop and we need to observe. These things are important. We need to learn where they come from. And because permaculture forces observation, that can lead us, in theory, to the development of a life of reciprocity. If we understand that, a lot of people in the economics in the ecological economics movement talk about trying to put a value on the ecosystem services that are provided by nature. I think that's ridiculous. It's impossible. How can you put a numeric value on the oxygen that we breathe, on the fertility of the soil that gives us the food, the purity of the water, the rain cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle? All of these things are invaluable, right? And if we observe that and we understand that food doesn't come from a factory, that energy doesn't come from some miraculous power plant, that all of these things come from the earth, and that if we want to maintain them, then that requires that we adapt our lifestyle, that we live in certain ways. If we see that, if we observe that, well, then we start to understand that we need to live in a more reciprocal manner, in a way that understands these patterns and that allows us to, in a sense, to try and develop lifestyles that fit our places. I think that's an important idea. And lastly, especially here in places that haven't been completely urbanized, completely westernized, if you want to use that term. For example, here in the rural parts of Central America where I live, I think that permaculture can be a means for reaffirming traditional lifeways. In Guatemala and El Salvador, where I worked and where I live, unfortunately, so many young people, through schooling and through just kind of the dominant ethos of our society today, have come to see, older generations, those who farm the land, those who build houses, with mud and local materials. They see that as backwards, as archaic, as something that needs to be left behind in this inevitable march of progress. And I think that's a problem. I think that there's an incredible amount of wisdom in vernacular lifeways, in traditional worldviews. And permaculture is a way for people who still kind of subsist in this area where people still see traditional pathways, traditional ways of growing food, of building homes, of harnessing energy. And it can create a sense of pride in that, right? So in communities where the rupture of an ancestral way of life is relatively recent, permaculture can be one tool for young people to revalue those ancient ways. And it doesn't mean you have to, stop there, stagnate there. Obviously you can innovate and create new ideas, but it starts with saying, there's a lot of value here, and we need to reaffirm that and show respect for that, right? That's my last slide. I have a short video here that is a little bit from Bill Mollison in his own words. It's a part of a documentary that was about him and his life and his whole path of discovering permaculture. So I'm going to share that real quick. It's about 3 minutes long, and then I will be done, and I will shut up and open up the floor for you all. So here's that video.
Sustainable system is any system that in its lifetime can produce more energy than it takes to establish and maintain it. Permaculture design is the first system of conscious functional design in the world. That's its unique aspect. And functional design is sustainable.
Permaculture was a concept that Bill Mollison and I worked on in the 70s. Today we call sustainability. It was based on a simple question related to the design of agriculture. If most of nature is dominated by perennial plants, trees and other long-lived plants, why is our agriculture dominated by annual crops? Why doesn't it follow the design rules of nature? We've got used to the idea that for any sort of key problem or important activity, there's one big solution that trumps all others, and some version of it ends up everywhere. Once you start dealing with nature and local resources, local situation, then the design solutions are all different.
When you look at a whole system, there are two things very undesirable. One is work, and the other one is pollution. Pollution is a product of work. Work is a result of not supplying every component of your system with its needs. Let's put that in way. If you didn't put a tank on your chicken house, you've got to carry water to the chickens. So you incur work. Now, if you don't collect the eggs from the chicken house, that's pollution. So pollution is an unused resource. It didn't go somewhere where it would be used.
It was actually the whole way we related to nature. And so human settlement, the design of houses, the way we organise everything in society was a part of that.
It comes from two Latin roots, permanence, to persist indefinitely, and culture, the practices that support human occupation. Put those together, it's a persistent system that supports human existence.
We eat food, we grow a garden, we grow the food in the garden and bring those things back together, rather than the industrial system which stretches everything out in these long supply chains.
Another thing which is also extraordinarily intriguing, when you design well, nature takes hold of what you've done and does it better. What you've got to do is watch the system and guide it slightly.
So permaculture is really a design system for both sustainable land use and sustainable living.
I suppose the simplest thing to say is that an attempt to build a good place to live.